Good morning. I'm Earl Wright, the co-founder and chairman of the board of Common Sense Institute. Welcome to the third Eggs in the Economy of 2020. It's a quarterly gathering to learn from policymakers and experts about the critical issues facing our wonderful state of Colorado. Today we have a great lineup. We're going to look ahead to the November ballot, where Coloradoans have 11 statewide initiatives to vote on this fall. This is not a record. We had a record of 14 some time ago. At CSI, we believe strongly in this full civility and open dialogue and conversation driven by facts. This year, CSI is celebrating 10 years with a primary mission to take a big, important policy issues before the legislature and voters and distill those proposals down to numbers, objective impact, to concrete facts that Coloradoans can internalize, understand, weigh, even as they try to make up their minds as to how they want to vote. Please watch this quick video to learn more about CSI and the important research we conduct.
A healthy, growing Colorado, built on a solid foundation, facts, bigger than bias, using the time-tested analytical tools to give the citizens the information they need. We are CSI, the Common Sense Institute, and our mission is to examine the fiscal impacts of policies and initiatives so that the laws that impact our lives allow individual opportunity to flourish, not skewed or bent by politics or partisanship. Our team includes some of the best and brightest policy minds in Colorado, and our board of directors from every corner of our state encompass all of Colorado's industries. We are committed to the protection and promotion of Colorado's economy, because in our opinion, that's just common sense. We are the Common Sense Institute.
To kick off today's discussion, I'm going to turn this over to our president and CEO, Christian Strong. Christian is a leading voice in the free enterprise and economic opportunity within Colorado. She has a career spanning small business, public policy, and philanthropy. Christian, please kick this off for us.
Thank you so much, Earl, and thank you for your leadership at Common Sense Institute, along with the rest of our great board. Really thrilled to have you all joining us this morning. I know a few more participants are trickling in. We have a wonderful lineup today of great panelists, and our Director of Policy and Research will be speaking shortly as well. We're going to look at several important issues on the November ballot. As Earl mentioned, this is a crowded ballot this time, with over 11 statewide ballot initiatives to be voted on by Coloradans in November. Let's really dive in right away to the topic. I want to start by looking at Amendment B, which is the repeal of the Gallagher Amendment. It was officially passed in 1982. The amendment set guidelines for the value of property and valuation for assessments of property. This ensured a 45 and 55% split for collections between residential and commercial properties. Amendment B would repeal the rate-setting formula and remove the required split between residential and commercial property. I'm thrilled that we're going to be joined by an excellent panel. At any point during the program, should you have any questions for our panelists, please feel free to use the chat button at the bottom of your screen or the Q&A button. Hopefully we'll have some time at the end of this moderated discussion for your questions as well. I'd like to kick it off by turning it to Joey Bunch. Joey is a leader in Colorado politics reporting. He has been with a senior correspondent, and he's deputy managing editor of Colorado Politics. He has over a 32-year career span, including the last 16 here in our state. He was part of the Denver Post team that won the Pulitzer Prize in 2013, and he's a two-time finalist. He's also my favorite Alabama fan. Roll Tide. So Joey, I'm going to turn it over to you. And at this point, I'd ask all of our panelists to please turn on your video and your microphones. Thanks so much.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here with us this morning. You know, I was just looking at the list of people that are participating today, and I think it's like all my friends. It's Friends of Joey. You're in a new club called Friends of Joey. But, you know, I think the real reason is because every one of you know that below my jacket and shirt, I'm wearing pajamas. You know, I used to have this nightmare all the time, but it looks like it's coming true today. So congratulations for being here for my nightmare. Let me introduce the panelists. We've got a great panel of people who know this issue a hell of a lot better than I do. We've got JoAnn Groff. She's the property tax administrator for the state of Colorado, and she heads the Division of Property Taxation for the Department of Local Affairs. She sat on the Board of Equalization from 1993 to 2005, and she was a Colorado State Representative from 83 to 89. And president of the Colorado Retail Association from 92 to 2005. You can all applaud for her in your homes. Kent Thiry, my friend Kent Thiry. You know, we don't see enough of Kent Thiry and the guys everywhere. He's the campaign chairman for Say Yes on Amendment B. You know, Kent, as we all know, is the recent retired CEO of DaVita after 20 years. And I would encourage you, I wrote a column about Kent when he retired a couple of 3 months ago. And I hope you'll go back and read it because Kent's a terrific guy and he's as interesting as he is brilliant. You know, Kent has been the face of the energy of so many successful statewide ballot questions. You know, the reestablishment of the presidential primary, opening primaries to unaffiliated voters, reforming congressional and state redistricting processes. You know, when Kent, he may be from Wisconsin, but he has definitely left his mark on Colorado. You know, he recently co-founded the Aspen Group with former Senators Bill Frist, who's a Republican, as you know, and Tom Daschle, who's a Democrat, who my friend Dick Wadhams, who's in the audience, who may be a friend of. You know, let's keep Kent and Dick apart this morning. But they're working on partisan healthcare reform. And my friend Michael Fields, he's executive director of Colorado Rising and Colorado Rising State Action. He's a young father, a veteran of the campaign trenches in Colorado, and a former college pitcher, as well as my very good friend. He was previously the state director of Americans for Prosperity in Colorado, and he serves as a Fox 31 Denver's political analyst. In his other job, he's a professor of American politics. And finally, my friend Michael Gifford, he's the president and CEO of Associated General Contractors. It's the state's leading construction association. It helps commercial construction general contractors, specialty contractors, and suppliers to gain a competitive advantage and improve the way they do business through advocacy, coalition building, legislative strategy, and regional economic development. Obviously, these are folks who know their way around this issue and around state politics, so that we're very lucky to have them. But let's just dive right into the questions. JoAnn, you understand this better than probably anybody here. Can you give us the basics of Amendment B and help me understand the current property taxation scheme that we have in Colorado that we refer to as the Gallagher Amendment?
Absolutely. Although I have to tell you, Kristen's introduction pretty much took all of what I was going to say. So, but being a former politician, I always have something else I can add. The Gallagher Amendment in 1982 was just that. It was an amendment to the whole constitutional amendment that was being proposed. And it defined a ratio relationship between all other properties and residential property. The concern was residential property was going to pick up too much of the property tax burden. And so this was added. It's worked well for 38 years. We started at a 21% residential assessment rate. We're now down to a 7.15% residential assessment rate because of that tie. One of the reasons it's gone down to that level is that residential values have gone up in the last 37 years. Initially starting, they were around 50% of the total value of the actual value of the state. They're now at well close to 80%. I think in 2019 it was 79 point change percent of the actual value. So that relationship is what's being addressed in Amendment B. And Amendment B is taking out of the Constitution that mandated 45-55% contribution. So residential property will no longer be restricted to 45, and all other will no longer pick up the 55%. So the second thing I was to address is, all right, that's great. That's talking about the assessed values, but what about taxes on that assessed value? And I'm going to talk just a little. So your assessed value on your home or your property is established by taking the actual value of your property. Everything in property tax goes back to the actual value. And then you multiply that actual value by your assessment rate. Then you get what your assessed value is, and it is that assessed value that is your contribution, your property's contribution into the assessed value pool for any particular taxing jurisdiction where your property is located. Then your taxing jurisdictions take that total pool of money and apply against it what they need to raise to be able to meet their budget and satisfy their obligations. So it's not a linear equation. If you have, and this has happened quite a bit recently, if you have bonded indebtedness, it doesn't matter if the assessed value pool is lower, you have to raise your mills, and you raise your mills automatically to cover that difference, what the assessed value pool isn't getting you to be able to pay your bonds. So debt always comes first. The second is that over the last few years, you've seen a number of jurisdictions, taxing jurisdictions, most predominantly fire and health special districts, go to their voters and say, if the residential assessment rate is the cause for us not being able to cover our budget requirements, allow us to raise your mills separately. So you've got two factors there that are going to influence what happens to that assessed value pool. But the assessed value pool times so the actual value times assessment rate equals what's in the assessed value pool. What happens on the tax end really is up to the laws and the constraints and the actions and voter permission to those taxing jurisdictions. So it's not a linear equation.
Well, now, Kent, let me ask you a question. You think we should get rid of Gallagher? And a lot of people are going to hear what JoAnn just said and said, that guy's trying to take my tax break, and I need that tax break. What do you say to that person?
Yeah, thanks, thanks, Joey, and thanks for that concise characterization, JoAnn and Kristen. And thanks to everyone for caring enough about this issue to be here. It's certainly a difficult time for the state and the country, and it's great that everybody cares. I'd make just 5 really quick points, Joey. Number one, people need a job. To have a job, you need a healthy local economy. To have a healthy local economy, you need small business. And the Gallagher amendment is just terrible on small business. This is very well documented. Nobody disputes it. And we're talking about a lot of bankruptcies and a lot of local businesses on Main Street that will be boarded up and replaced by Amazon. And that's just not what Colorado needs. It's not what the towns and cities. Number two, these people need protections. And if we repeal Gallagher through Amendment B, there'll be a freeze on the existing rates, and we'll still have the protection of Tabor that no one can raise. If we repeal Gallagher, no one can raise your tax rates without a vote of the people, not residential, not commercial, nothing. So we protect the protection of Tabor. Number three, we protect local control. You do not have a statewide formula telling you what you have to do locally, what your options are. And by the way, you've got to tax small business at a rate 4 or 5 times higher than residential. That's not what local control is about. Fourth of 5, this issue isn't even relevant for a lot of people for the reason that JoAnn referred to, because there's automatic offset provisions that kick in. So whatever way the statewide archaic 40-year-old formula goes, it's automatically offset by other adjustments. And fifth, what is the practical consequence in the real world of this 40-year-old antiquated piece of tax plumbing is that it means the people who have the most money including wealthy Texans with second homes in Vail and Aspen, are going to get the most benefit, and small businesses in half the counties across Colorado are going to be hurt.
Now, Michael, you're on the other side of this, and you've heard the critiques of this thing. From the start, this was said to have been, an effort by some legislators in Denver and Boulder to stick it to businesses. But, the practical effect of Colorado is that it seems to force businesses to pay more and more, yet rural communities get less and less. It feels like a Hobson choice, like there's no good answer here. So lend me some clarity. Is that an accurate characterization? Is this a no-win situation? Who is the winner here?
Well, thanks, Joey, and thanks for having me. I think first I would like to push back a little bit on this being characterized as a tax cut. Regardless of the assessment rate, we pay more in property taxes every single year. Property taxes are up 53%. Property tax rates or revenue is up 53% in just the last 5 years. Statewide, the Sun just did a really good article about the Gallagher Amendment and basically said that we pay double what we did when Gallagher passed adjusted for inflation. And I think in regards to business, I care a lot about business. I oppose, 118. I'm a sponsor of the fee ballot issue. But the Gallagher appeal doesn't do anything to help businesses. There's no drop to that 29% assessment rate. That is still going to be there. And businesses do matter, but I think people matter too. And we should be continuing to encourage home ownership. We should want to keep apartment costs low, especially during a recession. I'm a former teacher, and I made $33,000 a year at one point, and an increase to our rent had a huge impact on our lives. And you think about seniors who are on fixed income or Social Security, it has a big impact. And if their home value goes up, it doesn't add any more money into their pockets to pay these higher taxes. So I think we need to have a discussion about the business assessment rate. But this repeal doesn't do that. And we also, though, have to focus on what the impact is to individuals and to localities. I think there needs to be reform, but I just don't think this is it.
Well, now, Michael, you work with a very diverse group of interests, so I think you've got a broad view on this. What's the ultimate solution when we're talking about property taxes? And whether Amendment B passes or fails, what are the ideas that lend themselves to a long-term solution here?
Oh, thank you very much to CSI and to you, Joey, for that great question. And I am working with a number of interests that don't all start from the same place, but have a common interest, and that is that whether Amendment B were to pass or not pass, we're going to need an ultimate solution to this question. Because if it does pass, it's only a first step. And so just officially to make sure AGC has not taken a position on Amendment B, but is already looking to a longer term solution, and we're working with other like-minded groups. And I want to back up just a little bit to say that for a state to have a quality of life system and an economic system, it needs to have a system that adequately funds schools, other services like fire districts and other special districts, and Colorado has a lot of special districts, counties, and local government that delivers services to the citizens and supports business. And so if you look at just a couple of things in CSI's own information, commercial property rates, property taxes paid in Colorado are up to twice as much as other cities like Los Angeles or Seattle. So that's a tough place to be. The state is funding a significant portion of the K through 12 school budget out of other general fund revenue, mostly income tax and sales tax. And so our interest is, and when JoAnn talked about the mill levy floating up, every time that floats up, business gets 5 times the increase as residential, because the 29% now versus a 7, or what's coming next, 29% versus 5. Is that a good system to provide that quality of life and that economic system for the state? And so we want to launch a study that'll look at all the Western states and see if there's a more effective way to set the property tax so that it provides those services that we need and provide some relief to that state budget so we can have the other things that we need from the state to provide that quality of life and that economic system, like infrastructure investment, healthcare, and the other things that really haven't been able to be funded at the state level. So that's where we are right now. We don't have any conclusions yet, but we do think within the Western states we will get some effective ideas, and we want to have this study done by the end of the year so we can present that to the legislature in January.
Well, that's great, guys. Hey, I want to throw a question out to the group, but before I do that, I want to remind our participants to give us some questions in the Q&A. You know, I pay my property taxes every year, and that's about as much as I know about this. So tell us how this affects you, and give our panelists some questions. You won't get a better opportunity to ask people who understand this issue. So put them there in the comments, and Kristen will fill them, and we'll throw them at the panelists when we get through here. But to all the panelists, why are we here? I mean, I ask myself that all the time. I walk into the kitchen and ask myself why I'm there. But why are we here and now on Gallagher? You know, this has always been characterized as such a bone crusher for so many years. So why is it taking so long to get it before voters? You know, give me a political history lesson. And Michael, you're the professor, so you start. Why are we just now voting on this in this economic climate?
I think it's in front of voters right now because there's a budget shortfall, and the end of session came and they wanted to fill that because they backfill the education budgets, and there was no appetite to quickly reform the education funding formula, which I think needs to happen first, regardless. But I think when you look at it, there needs to be something that is done. I think that it should be a regional approach. More than a statewide repeal and replace with the same rates that they have right now. I think when you look at the legislature, when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and they want to smash through all the good parts of Gallagher in order to get to some of these reforms. I think the reforms have been talked about for a while, but there was a committee in the legislature that looked at, and I think they came up with 6 different options, this being one of them, the repeal. I think the best option is that regional approach. And, when you don't have a plan for what comes next, I think that's what scares voters. And so they're moving quickly on this repeal, but they don't really have a replacement at all. Nobody knows what comes next. Our business, are they going to push for higher ones, lower ones on businesses? Nobody knows. And so I think it is bad timing, especially during a recession, to be talking about this. I think that people are going to want lower property taxes. They want them to remain low, and we do have to address this problem, though.
Well, Kent, you're a driver. You're not a passenger. So where are we going? Why are we here? And where is this headed?
Yeah, I would say we're here because the cumulative damage has become so obvious to rural hospital districts, to rural firefighter districts, to K through 12, to small business, and we're losing our competitive advantage to other states. The reason is really simple, that COVID has put a spotlight on the fact that this is terrible policy for the Colorado economy. And it's unfair policy because it's an arbitrary 40-year-old statewide formula that dictates terms for counties and cities and districts across the entire state in ways that are tragic. And now with a spotlight on it, people are going, how in the heck did we get here? I haven't met a single Democrat, Republican, or independent who says if they were writing policy today, they would write the policy we have. And so we're here because it's bad policy doing damage. And as for replacement plan, repealing Gallagher B puts us in a good place all by itself, because it takes our residential rates, which are the 3rd lowest in the country, and freezes them, and then protects Tabor so that no one can increase a residential or non-residential rate without a vote of the people. So we don't need to have a replacement plan beyond that right now. We can, and with the kind of work that Michael's doing and others, maybe there'll be some further improvements to that. But that by itself, a freeze at a wonderfully low level and Tabor protection, that's a good reality right there compared to the train wreck that's unfolding currently.
Well, now, JoAnn, you were elected to the legislature in the same election where the Gallagher Amendment passed. So tell me about the political climate. I mean, what were the arguments for and against it at that time? Or did you have your own problems in that election?
Joey, I was not paying attention to the Amendment 1 of 1982 other than to say that I voted for it, and I voted for it because my assessor told me to. So, so let me bring a little bit of insight into why now, why people are paying attention now. Folks really started paying attention to the residential assessment rate driven by the formula in the Constitution back in 2017. Prior to 2017, we had 14 years, 7 reassessment cycles of the rate being at 7.96, the residential assessment rate being at 7.96. And everybody had gotten pretty used to it. They built their budgets on that. And then in 2017, it became clear that the residential assessment rate was going to drop. And that's when lots of districts out there recognized what it was going to do to their budgets. And so from 2017 until now, during these 3 years, it's had much more attention. And that's why you're seeing this happen. It was the catalyst to the Alternatives to Gallagher Committee, and this solution was actually one of the main solutions that came out of that study group. What I find interesting is that the work on this constitutional amendment was actually being done prior to COVID, but obviously I think its passage was well influenced, Kent, by the COVID situation.
Well, Giff, you heard what everybody said. Put a bow on this for us. What do you think? Michael Gifford.
Yes, Joey, thank you very much. And I agree that we're here because of budget concerns, dollar concerns, starting with what JoAnn referenced with the special districts and some of the local governments. But if you also look at the state budget this year for education alone, would have been an actual cut if not for the federal COVID funds of 600+ million that kind of backfilled that. If those funds don't come next year, then you're looking at the double whammy of making up that 500 to 600 million plus another, say, 500 million from the reduction in the assessment rate on residential to in the 5% range. And so that caused this action to take place. I will add that while there is a Tabor protection from increasing the assessment rate for either commercial or residential, I'll be honest that one of the reasons we're involved is that we feel that an assessment rate increase on commercial, even as high as we are compared to other cities, if that went to the voters, that might be a popular thing for voters to vote on, have businesses pay more and residents pay less. So we don't necessarily feel super protected by Amendment B passing and the legislature having that added up, about $1 billion budget problem. How do we solve that? So we're hopeful to have a good study that'll show the entire waterfront of how much do residents pay in other states? How does that compare? How does a business pay? And then how does that relate to all of the services that need to be provided? But I think the budget dollars are why we're staring at this, and that's going to continue to have a focus as the 2021 legislature starts, because they're going to have that big shortfall to deal with. I hope my math is close, but I'm talking 500 million and $1 billion chunks. So I think at least the scale of it, I'm pretty close.
$1 billion here, $1 billion there, pretty soon it's talking real money. Hey, JoAnn, let's get back into the mechanics of this thing. The assessment rates are only, one part of the property tax equation, and the other is the mill levy rates that each taxing authority, the schools and the water and fire districts, those sorts of people. Tell us about the automatic mill levy increases and the other local workarounds.
So you have a few. I touched on them briefly, but bonded indebtedness, when districts ask for money from their voters to pay for bonds, almost all of those have an automatic provision that say mill levies will go up if the assessment pool doesn't raise the right amount of money. So that will allow them to go up. A number of special districts have asked their voters, they called it de-Gallagherization, that if for some reason their budget isn't maintained at a whole level, they can go and automatically raise the mill levy to cover whatever shortfall is in their revenue picture. But those are somewhat exceptions to the rule. The rest of property tax goes to support, they've been voted on over the years, and it goes to support the functions of that particular taxing jurisdiction, whatever those functions are. And although you might be stabilizing the residential assessment rate contribution in this particular proposal, that in no way is going to guarantee that we aren't going to be facing questions from our taxing jurisdictions to raise mill levies. And we analyze those as voters each time we're asked, and we vote for them or we don't vote for them. When one part of Tabor was that if a particular district's revenues grew beyond certain measures, that they would have to lower mill levies. Many districts, many taxing jurisdictions have gone to their voters over the last 30 years since Tabor passed and asked for an exemption from that. So most mill levies do not go down, although for some taxing jurisdictions, they have temporarily adjusted their mill levies. So mill levies aren't a mystery, but they're set by each individual taxing jurisdiction. It is not controlled by the state.
Well, Kent, you're the last person I have to tell that politics never happen in a vacuum. Do you think this discussion would be different if not for COVID-19, if not for the economic recession, you know, if not for the liberal winds of change that have been blowing across Colorado the last couple of years? Would this conversation be different?
Well, I actually think it has nothing to do with any liberal winds blowing anywhere. I mean, there's a reason why I mean, the number of endorsers of repealing Amendment B across the entire political spectrum. You're talking about, I mean, quite a combination of chambers, everything from Grand Junction to Boulder to Denver to Colorado Springs to Greeley. I mean, and the National Federation of Independent Business talking about the bankruptcy, not just hiring fewer people, not just not giving raises, but actual bankruptcies among small business because of Gallagher being added on top of all the other COVID challenges. So I don't think it has anything to do with wind anywhere. It has to do with the fact that we got a lot of people that are economically hurting. And what COVID has done is incredibly unfortunate, but it has put a spotlight on a cancer within our tax system. And the beauty of freezing rates where they are and having that Tabor protection is quite formidable during these uncertain economic times, because in the end, if we don't have healthy small business, nothing else will work. You can't make up for losing that economic engine. You can't make up for losing that soul of your local community. You can't make that up. And so that's a foundational thing that we need to protect. I'll stop there.
Well, now, Michael, you might want to speak to that as well, but you've also said that, you know, Gallagher is not perfect, that it needs to be reformed. So, you know, what changes does it need? What would you support in changing Gallagher?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier, I think a regional approach makes more sense. This is obviously a problem that impacts localities in the Western Slope, in rural areas, you know, and basically that chart in the Colorado Sun article talked about what this, how this impacts each part of the state over the years. And I think it's really good to look at that. I think that regional approach, giving more actual local control, this bill doesn't do that. It sets the assessment rates again, and it doesn't really give localities any more control than they have right now, which I think is a problem. And I think, you know, that legislators, like, you can't, you know, I'm not going to come up with a plan that the legislature is just going to adopt. You need those coalition partners in order to do it. And I think this current repeal doesn't have, you know, it doesn't have a plan. And if you look at even the Boulder Daily Camera, which, you know, came out in support of the repeal, shockingly, but they said it's like cutting the plumbing pipes without having any equipment to replace them. There's a lot of uncertainty that comes along with it. And when you're trying to build trust, like, you need trust in legislators on what's going to come next. And when you don't have anything, that creates a problem. When you have legislators who are writing biased ballot language and rewriting the nonpartisan blue book in order to hide information from voters, I think people are going to have a negative reaction. And I don't think it's surprising that chambers and editorial boards will come out in favor of this. But I think, when you talk to the average person, when you talk to people, somebody posted something on Nextdoor in my neighborhood about this 9 News story, and it just blew up. And I think you're going to see that a lot as people get more educated about this. But I definitely think, look, a regional approach, counties should be having a more of a say in this. And if you look at that article, it shows where the problem is, and it's not in the Front Range at all, where a majority of people are, and the majority of people would see these higher property taxes.
Hey, Joey, can I build on that for a moment?
Sure.
Thank you, because Michael and I agree on something, and that is that local control is a big deal. Really important in our lives, really important in how our communities feel and prosper or not. And repealing Gallagher is a tremendous step forward in restoring local control, because right now there's an arbitrary statewide formula that subjects, roughly speaking, half of all the counties that are below average in terms of growth, that don't have a lot of more people moving in, don't have housing prices going up by a lot. It takes the other half of Colorado and makes arbitrary statewide allocation decisions, which are then imposed on all these local communities. And then if that local community, to JoAnn's point, wants to do something with their mill levies, Gallagher forces them to tax small business at a rate that's 4 or 5 times higher than residential, something that no one would ever design today and try to pass in the legislature or with the people. And so I agree with Michael, local control is such a big deal for Colorado and for America, in fact, and repealing Gallagher puts us back on a track towards putting local control where it belongs.
And Michael Gifford, I'm going to ask you to back cleanup again. What's your prediction? Where is the long-term solution going to come from? Is it going to come from the voters, or is it going to come from the legislature?
Well, I would actually, I'll answer that first and then back up my answer. It will most likely come through the legislature referring another question to the voters. Part of that is the expense of initiating a measure and taking it forward versus having the legislature refer it. Part of it is being able to write the ballot language so it can be in plain language and understand. I could be wrong, but that's my, but I think the voters actually will ultimately approve that. I do agree with Michael and Kent that local control in this issue is an intriguing idea and helps the communities that are affected by the current system do a better job of funding their services. And since that would be either still in the Constitution if B fails, or in statute if it passes, it's going to have to start with the most likely with the legislature. So that's where I think this is. And I will say that I personally, this is my personal feeling, is that business, while it's affected at those high rates that others have referenced, we haven't done the best job of providing recommended solutions. And that's why we're endeavoring to do this study. We need to do our homework a little bit better before we complain anymore and be part of the solution. So that's what we plan to do. And we'll see what happens in January.
Well, I see my friend Kristen Strom is back with us, which means that we've got some questions from the audience. But I want to thank all of our panelists who just did a wonderful job. And every time I talk to each one of you, I feel like I'm smarter. So thank you. Kristen, what does our audience want to know?
Thanks, Joey. Great questions for all the panelists. We do have a few questions from the audience, and I want to make sure that we have time to get to all of them. Speaking of local control, I have a question to start off for JoAnn. Can a local fire district de-Gallagher under the current law?
So yes, but I want to explain just a little bit about what de-Gallagher means. Any district, fire protection, they're the ones that have done it the most, can go to their voters and ask them a question of, can we be exempt, can our budget be exempt from the effects of a change in the residential assessment rate, a downward spiral of the residential assessment rate? And the answer is yes, but it's a Tabor election. It is not actually de-Gallagherization. What happens in that case? There is one assessment rate in the state, and it is whatever the legislature says it's going to be. based on the Constitution as it currently sits. So if you have a de-Gallagherization in a particular district and it passes, what happens is the mill levy adjustment can go up in that particular district if the change in the residential assessment rate means the district's values go down. So although it's tied to the residential assessment rate, it actually doesn't negate what the state says the residential assessment rate will be. To make that in better English, because that was a whole lot of property tax gobbledygook, the mill levies for everybody go up if a district has de-Gallagherized.
Perfect. Anybody want to add to that? I think that was a great answer. Thanks, JoAnn. Next question from the audience. The legislature will obviously face tough negotiations next session. How will the passage or defeat impact the legislature economically and politically? Michael, Gifford, do you want to start off maybe with that? I know that your group's looking at more of a long-term solution, so.
Well, if the question is, what will the legislature face next year if Amendment B does not pass? Residential assessment rate is predicted to go down to the 5% range. That would affect, based on CSI's own study, about $700 million combined to school districts and counties in reduced revenue, not even talking about some of the other special districts. So the local districts would have to deal with that. In the case of school districts, I'm assuming that the state would then attempt to backfill about a $500 million change. And if that's the case, that would add to a tough budget year for the state. If Amendment B does not pass, or if it does pass, in statute, the assessment rate would stay at 7%, and that assumes that $700 million would not be reduced at the local level, and the state would face less of a backfill question for K through 12 school districts specifically. Beyond that, I'd be glad to hear some of the predictions of the other panelists.
Michael, thanks for your continuation of plugging the CSI report. I did link our latest report, which we just released yesterday on Amendment B. It's on our website, available for download. A lot of these great facts and figures are included in the report. I encourage attendees to download it and read it. It's a great read, and hopefully would inform you as you're casting your vote. Kent or Michael, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, Kristen, I would first say that Michael covered it quite well. But in the end, despite the fact that we all know that some cuts are going to have to take place and have taken place, and that hurts. That's hard on everyone. That the only way out of this difficult situation is growth. That in the end, it doesn't matter exactly what your property taxes are because you lose your house because you can't pay the mortgage. And so we need to create an environment in Colorado for healthy, prudent growth to get us back on track. And I think because of the work that Michael and others are doing, there's an increasing appreciation within the legislature and in the governor's office about the need to stimulate growth. I happen to be the chair of something called the Colorado Gap Fund, where we've raised about $27 million so far to do loans to small businesses. And we were stunned. We had to close down our applications after the first couple of weeks because it was something like 3,000 applications in the first week, more in the second week. We've had to take a break because, and if you read these applications, it would break your heart. These are small businesses throughout the entire state, rural and urban, that are literally on the verge of going under or have gone under, but would like to come back from the dead. And I think there's a growing appreciation that Michael points to, that growth is the only way out to serve all our communities well.
Anybody have anything else to add? Okay, next question related to this topic, a two-part question. How do you see the effect on the budget stabilization factor for K-12 education? In addition, if the state does not have the ability to backfill, can they just take money from K-12 to balance the budget? Is that correct? Michael Fields, do you want to start?
what was the first question again?
Sure. How do you see the effect on the budget stabilization factor for K-12 education?
Yeah, I think one, it's hard to know what that is going to look like. You know, we've had projections on what revenue. We've obviously had cuts, but every time that a new report comes in, revenue goes up. And so I think it's hard to know exactly how much money will be impacted in the next year's state budget. Obviously, this will have an impact on if the repeal happens or not, on how much is backfilled by the state. I think when you look at, you know, the whole budget, I guess I don't really understand the question of balancing the budget with K-12 money, given that it's the same budget, right? That you're having to pay certain things. The education funding formula will make it so that we do go up in per pupil funding. How much that is, it's hard to know right now. And so, you know, this will definitely have an impact. But I think we do have struggling government, local government, and state government. During a pandemic. I think that's, you know, usual. But on the other hand, we have to think about individuals and how things are impacting their day-to-day lives and how education is changing in general, given, you know, that a lot of people are leaving districts, you know, more people in charter schools and homeschooling. And so I think a lot of this is going to have to be figured out over the next few years. But hopefully our economy does come back strong. And it's starting to do that, but you know, we just don't know what's going to happen with vaccines and everything else, and so I think there's a lot of unknowns going into the next session.
Kristen,
Anybody else? Sure.
can I add something a little bit, Kristen? Michael made many good points there. One of the things that happens is when there's an arbitrary change that means that a rural district is going to have lower tax collections because of this statewide formula and because Denver's growing well. So when you start with that, the state then does have certain backfill obligations, as Michael and others have commented on, and JoAnn. But that does further reduce local control over education because more and more of the money is coming from the state. And in addition, what's so difficult at a time when there's so much work for us to do, to have a huge amount of political oxygen sucked out of the room because you're spending all this time, as Michael said, just trying to play with the same amount of money. It's just been dislocated. It's been moved in a dysfunctional way that we have to make up for. And so when you think of all that hard work the legislature has to do that Michael Fields is referring to, it's all that political dysfunction and distraction created by something that didn't need to happen because it's skewing and moving dollars around in a way that nobody wanted, nobody voted for, but then the poor legislature has to work for hours and hours and hours just to get back to the status quo that existed 2 years earlier. And as Michael said, there's an awful lot of work to be done. And this Gallagher adjustments all the time and readjustments is a source of tremendous energy loss.
There are so many components to Amendment B and Gallagher. So let's switch gears a little bit, talk about one of the other components. What protections will this provide to commercial property owners that even if a tax increase is sent to the voters won't say, we'll tax them, not me. And we all know buildings can't vote to express their concerns. Who would like to take that?
I'll take it really quickly. I think one thing is that definitely a possibility. People in the state don't know how much commercial property taxes are. The average person doesn't. And so I fear when it is decoupled, when these two are decoupled from each other, residential and commercial, that somebody could go to the ballot and say businesses need to pay more. And I think that would have a good shot of passing. And so knowing that repealing Gallagher makes it so that is a statutory change. So you have less signatures you'd have to get, a lower amount of, you don't get 50% instead of 55%. I think that should be a fear for businesses given the climate that we're under right now. I think there is protection from that increase right now, and I don't think that would be in the future. So yeah, business taxes could go down if the legislature decides to do that. I don't think they're going to do that given all the revenue talk that we're talking about, that would be a cut to their budget. And I don't think that's ever going to happen. But I think there is a legitimate threat that decoupling it could lead to higher commercial property taxes.
Yeah, and I would take a different perspective on that. If we don't repeal Gallagher, business taxes are certainly going to go up. Because again, every time that a local community has to institute mill levy changes, because they want to keep the firefighters employed, because they want to keep the ambulances running. They have to do so at this 4-to-1 and soon to be 5-to-1 ratio. They have no choice. So if we don't repeal this now, business is certainly 100% probable to experience significant tax increases over time. And so by freezing at the current residential rates at the wonderfully low level, and then relying on the Tabor protection, and I hear you, Michael Gifford. Of course, one never knows exactly what the people will do, but the citizens of Colorado have a track record of being quite prudent around messing around with tax increases. And so I take great solace in the fact that our population has an empirical history of understanding that they want their communities to be served by small business. They want an overall healthy economy. So I come out quite optimistic about that Tabor protection.
Any other thoughts, JoAnn, Michael Gifford?
I would, Kristen, add that, and I hear what Kent is saying, and again, stating that this is the reason why AGC wants to, and others want to look to the future. Two thoughts. Yes, the taxpayers, if I am correct, have never approved a tax increase that has been a general tax increase like an income or a sales tax. They have approved tobacco, marijuana, and gambling taxes, which are kind of, we put those in a specialty type of bucket. But is it really healthy that we're sending money to the state and then back to certain local functions like school districts, and that local connection is lost? And so do we know that we're going to need to have another ultimate solution to this, even if B passes and we do have the freeze? And that may give us some time to do it. If it doesn't pass, we're still going to need the answer. And I think this morning it's just brought up all the reasons that we need to get to making sure that we see if there's a best practice out there in other areas of the country in the West.
One last question for the panel, and then we will wrap it up. This question relates to the notion that the panel has discussed this morning that residential property taxes are expected to decrease to 5.88%. The notion that property taxes will increase, while tax payments may increase in counties where market values are increasing, this will not happen in many communities, rural, etc., where housing values are stagnant, which will translate into lower property tax collections and service cuts. Can Michael Fields address this and talk about what should happen to the public services in those communities that are highly dependent on property tax? Michael, we'll start with you.
Sure. I think when you look at it, even this year, property tax, even during the recession, property tax revenue is expected to go up 10%. Even if the assessment does go down, revenue will still go up as it does. And you look at the chart throughout, since Gallagher passed, that revenue still continues to go up. And this is a problem in certain places, not everywhere. And if you look at, this is one of the issues with not coming up with a better solution out of the gate, right? That there's another assessment drop that would happen. There was no talk about, maybe lowering commercial a little bit and residential a little bit less. There was no negotiation over this, and I don't think it's going to pass. And so then we go another year or another 2 years without a real solution at all. And those localities are hurt. But I think you also have to think about those localities and the areas that we're talking about. Individuals are struggling too. And to see, a lesser increase to their property tax bill is going to be a good thing for them. And so I think we have to deal with this and deal with it quickly. And I want the legislature to do it and do a regional approach. I just don't think I think this is actually wasting more time when this doesn't pass in November. People are going to have to go back to work and figure out that problem for those parts of the state, which really isn't a problem again on the Front Range.
Other thoughts from panelists before we wrap up?
What I would say, again, is that repealing Gallagher is a great first step. Unambiguous good for an antiquated policy that, again, no one would write if you were writing policy today. No one asserts that on any side of this discussion. If you have a fire in a part of your house, you put out the fire. And then you start worrying about moving around the furniture or redesigning part of the house. And right now, no one disputes the fact that unless we repeal Gallagher, there's going to be, once again, tremendous economic dysfunction, particularly for hospital districts, firefighter districts, police districts, ambulance districts, K through 12 rural, and small business. No one disputes the fact that really bad stuff will happen to those human beings in those local communities. So let's stop that. Let's prevent that. Let's prevent the patient from getting sicker. And yes, then we can start working on other things. But right now, we can avoid a lot of economic pain for a lot of our communities. Let's do that and then move on, because they are right. We could be more thoughtful going forward. But first, let's stop the pain.
JoAnn, any final words?
I was just going to remind everyone that what the current what the current calculation talks about isn't taxes. It's the contribution of residential value into the valuation pool against which taxes are set. So there is some local area. There's a lot of local government ability to influence that. The problem becomes they're going to have to go to another vote of their people to fix it. But Gallagher itself has worked exactly as it intended to over the years. The residential assessment rate's gone from 21% down to 7.15. And if the voters of the state want to continue that relationship, they'll vote no. If they think that that relationship has worked really well and maybe we should look to a different solution, they'll vote yes.
Thanks, JoAnn. Michael Gifford, any last comments?
No, I think it's been thoroughly covered, so thank you.
Well, thank you so much to all of our panelists. I'm going to turn it over to my friend Joey Bunch to do final wrap up. Really appreciate you moderating this great discussion today. If you do want to share this webinar with any of your colleagues or friends, it will be available on the Common Sense Institute website later today. Joey.
Wow, I can't think of anything to add to this. I understand this topic so much better now, and we can thank these panelists that we have, and we thank the Common Sense Institute for putting this on. It adds a great level of understanding, but also takes out a lot of the political spin when we have the Common Sense Institute just giving us the numbers and leaving out the spin. I think spin has replaced facts. So thank you, Kristen, and thank to the Institute, and I look forward to hearing what Chris Brown has to say about the next 3 ballot questions we're going to talk about.
That's right. Don't hop off just yet. Thanks again to all of our panelists. If you all want to turn off your video, we do have one more short presentation. Obviously, we said this might be the longest ballot in Colorado history regarding statewide initiatives, and we want to make sure that you have the facts and data behind several of those other important issues. It's my pleasure now to introduce our Director of Policy and Research, Chris Brown. He's been with Common Sense Institute for about 3 years, formerly spent over a decade with REMI, Regional Models, Inc., working on both federal and regional policy issues and modeling them. We're thrilled that we have him on our team. He's had a busy last few months, making sure that we get all this important work done to help voters become educated and informed on the issues that impact them. Chris, I'll turn it over to you. We will have some time after Chris discusses a few issues for Q&A as well, so feel free to log those.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you. And thank you to everyone for sticking with us. It's a tough act to follow. As Kristen said, I want to run through some of these issues that we've put out research on, and we'll talk about it at the end. But just yesterday, we released our condensed ballot guide where you can find some of the key findings from the research, along with links to the full reports if you haven't had time to dissect them in more depth. And yeah, thanks to the panelists and thanks to JoAnn and your team. I wanted to just highlight the fact that you guys put out some great work that we used in our research around Amendment B. I can't promise I read every page of the 900-page annual report you guys put out. It seems like a tremendous amount of work you guys do, but really appreciate the analysis and the amount of information that is available that, again, really is essential for populating and and delivering the work that we can provide. So with that, the 4 issues that we focused on for the 2020 ballot are Proposition 116, Proposition 117, 118, and then just as of earlier this week, released analysis on Amendment B. So let's move forward. Proposition 116 is a across-the-board income tax reduction, proposing to cut the state's current income tax from 4.63% to 4.55%. What we ended up doing was developing a dynamic analysis, a dynamic economic analysis of this proposal to look at not just the static impact, which the state produced an estimate for, but also the extent to which we see these dynamic or cascading impacts as, this is an issue which really presents a clear, sort of classic economic trade-off where the private sector will have an increase in income, an increase in ability to consume, save, and retain their earnings, and state government in particular will have slightly less revenue to spend. So the static estimate is in the range of starting at about $160 million tax cut, growing to over $170 million in the first couple of years. We can move on to the next slide. So to perform the dynamic analysis, what we did is created 2 scenarios that essentially reflect the potential for difference, that will reflect a difference in how the government would respond to a reduction in revenue and the extent to which they would cut spending that directly impacts state jobs versus cutting spending in a way that might cut purchasing, cut equipment, cut some capital expenditure, but doesn't directly influence state jobs. And so we came up with, again, these 2 sets of results in scenario A and B. We'll move on to the next slide. And just to give you a snapshot of the summary results across both these scenarios, we can look at the employment impacts and the average annual employment effect over the first 5 years of this. From a dynamic standpoint, we would see a net reduction in jobs around 300 a year to growth in jobs of around 1,500, again, on an annual average basis over the first 5 years of the program. The impacts on GDP, again, range from a net reduction in around $800,000 to a growth in GDP. And in the out years, it retains is more positive. The initial years is where the impact is potentially slightly more negative, again, depending on the state's reaction, but growing to over $41 million potential GDP impact. So again, in summary, looking at Proposition 116, the tax cut would help to alleviate some of the pressures and some of the negative impacts that the recession has caused to the private sector, while sort of adding to some of the budgetary strain that the state is facing, again, as a result of this recession. So moving on to the next slide. Moving to Proposition 117, this is a vote going to ask voters whether or not they want to have a similar authority in approving fees and an increase in fees similar to the way that voters currently have authority to and a vote in increasing taxes. So specifically, Proposition 117 asks whether or not voters want future approval of new fees that would generate or projected to generate or would actually generate over $100 million over the first 5 years of the implementation. And our research has really tried to look at the history of fees as they have become a sort of a central part of how the state has raised revenue, maybe and maybe in a way which people are not as familiar with. And they really play a sort of a role as one of 3 major elements to state spending, including state taxes, that's sales tax, income tax, federal spending that is passed through the state, and then fees through things like lottery, tuition, hospital provider fee. So there's a range of fees that are built into that. Just looking at the history, please, yep, next slide. And again, I'd encourage you to go and find the full report. There's a breakdown of this in more depth. You know, this is the history of fees is really intertwined with the history of Tabor. And since the beginning of implementation of Tabor, at the beginning, fees represented about 46%, just slightly less than, excuse me, let me rephrase that. Revenue exempt from Tabor represented about 46%, just less than half of total state spending. Through the years, now roughly 69%, so over 2/3 of all state spending is exempt from Tabor, and that includes, again, the federal revenue, but also this fairly substantial increase in fee-based revenue, which again has not been directly voted on, largely not been directly voted on by Coloradans, and is again exempt from the spending limits and the provision of tax increases inherent in Tabor. Let's move on to the next slide. On a per Coloradan basis, if we look at the blue line, we can see total general fund appropriations per Coloradan have grown, but have remained fairly stable through from 2000 through 2018. But we've seen a substantial increase in fee-based revenue. So since 2000, as this graph articulates, for every dollar increase in general fund in appropriations per Coloradan, fee-based revenue has increased by $4.22. So at a rate 4 times as fast as general fund revenue. Next slide. So moving on to Proposition 118, this is our more recent analysis on the proposal to create a state-run paid family and medical leave insurance benefit program. This is a proposal to, again, establish this statewide, essentially a universal program where workers across the state, we estimate over 85% of state workers would be enrolled in this. A larger number would be eligible, but there's some ability to opt out or be exempted. And so our estimates suggest that probably 85% or more of Coloradan workers would be covered by this benefit program, which would offer a paid leave, so replacing wages while workers are on leave, up to 90% of wages, although that's on a progressive scale and declines as you make more in income. It would allow to take leave for up to 12 to 16 weeks within a 12-month period. And I think an important part to recognize within this benefit structure is that it covers what is categorized generally as family leave. So caregiving leave, bonding with a child, caregiving for a family member, as well as covers personal medical leave, which is largely thought of in this idea of short-term disability. So let's move on, next slide. Our focus in this research was really trying to understand and project the costs. So we actually developed a model that we hope to put on our website here very shortly that you and other Coloradans can actually test alternatives. But I think Coloradans can reflect on and understand the potential benefits that they might face and would be afforded to them through this benefit program if they don't currently have this benefit through their employer, or if they do have the benefit through their employer, how this compares. But we think that to this point, the costs of this program have not been fully explored, and as Coloradan and as voters weigh this decision, should really understand the cost of this, as it is ultimately paid for through a wage-based premium or a wage-based tax on all wages that is split 50-50 paid by both employers and employees. But one of the most important considerations in understanding the cost is ultimately the degree to which people use the program. If no one uses the insurance program, the rates will stay pretty low and remain very affordable. However, if the more people that use the benefit, the more in benefit payments that the program has to make, and ultimately the higher the premiums will need to be to cover those benefits, similar to any insurance program that is out there. And this program in particular offers significantly higher benefits, particularly in the graph that we're looking at, the chart that we're looking at here, as it relates to the wage replacement rate. So one of the biggest factors that influences whether or not someone will take leave is how much of their income is being replaced as a result of this program. And so as you can see, relative to some of the existing programs in other states which have a history of making payments that we can gauge their financial success against, we can see that this program has a significantly higher level wage replacement rate, which we think will influence the degree to which the program is ultimately utilized. So go to the next slide. So what we did is we developed scenarios, 3 scenarios, a low range, a mid-range, and a high range, to look at that utilization of the program across 2 factors. So across claims rates, so how many people on average would actually take the benefit relative to how many people are eligible, and how long of leave will they take, the average weeks of leave. So across those 2 dimensions that really influence this concept of utilization, we looked at, again, a low range of a 5% claims rate and a 9 weeks of average leave, to a mid-range to a high range of 9% utilization. So 9% of Coloradans would take leave and take 11.5 weeks on average. Where we came up with these numbers is from a lot of the recommendations that were made to the task force, the Family Leave Task Force, which convened out of legislation that was passed during last state legislative session in 2019. So the previous, not just the one that concluded here this summer, but the 2019 legislative session put together a task force, and some of the expert recommendations recommended a range of 5 to 7%, but in other states, they've seen claims rates even higher. And again, tying it back to the previous slide, Colorado would offer a higher range of benefits in many ways, and therefore we wanted to put a higher range of claims rates and average length of leave. To note in this chart, what we are really looking at is not just the cost, but also the solvency. So on the y-axis, you can see what the premium is that would be required to fund the program and how high that premium would have to go. In the legislation, in the proposition, there is a cap on the premium of 1.2%. So the suggestion that the premium cannot go above 1.2% as it's currently written, and somewhere between our middle and high scenario, the fund would actually face insolvency and require further legislative action, either a reduction in the benefits or an increase in the premium. Again, I think it's important to note that there is no mechanism in the proposition to explicitly reduce benefits in the event we see the costs start to rise. And so the solvency concerns are important to consider given this range of where we think the utilization will likely land. Next slide, please. So if we look at a couple dimensions on how what the program financials might look like across the impacts on the program's financials overall, the employee costs, and the potential employer costs, we can see our range produces a premium rate of between 0.7 and 1.7. The total premiums collected would range from $1.3 billion to $3.1 billion. Again, this is in year 5 when we think maybe some of the utilization would stabilize and the premiums would stabilize. The employee share of the premiums would range from $700 million to $1.7 billion, and the employer share would range from 580 to 1.4 billion dollars. And the total benefit payments, again accounting for some administrative costs, would range between 1.1 and 2.6 billion dollars per year. Again, by year 5. Next slide, please. If we look at how this would impact the employee directly, this looks across a range of wages on the left, and compares our scenarios in terms of the premium against the current income tax of 4.63%. And so you can see for someone making $50,000, their current income tax is about $2,300. The premium increase would range from $180 to $425 per year, which is an effective increase of between 8 and 18% on current income taxes. Next slide. In testing the solvency, now we didn't predict exactly when or how, what the probability of facing insolvency was, but we can test what these points of solvency might be. So you can say, if the claims rate, if the utilization reaches a rate that sort of effectively reflects a claims rate of 6.2%, and with an average week of leave of 9.5 weeks, if that's how the program starts, then the premiums that were collected to fund those benefits in the initial year would not be sufficient, as the program starts out with a 0.9% premium. After the first 2 years, as the premium can float to 1.2%, the solvency, the program can remain solvent so long as utilization remains below 7.5% in terms of claims rate and below 10.2 weeks of average leave. Next slide. So I guess one way to look at this, and one point to make for those listening that are business owners, hiring workers, that part of the challenge, or a large part of the challenge, is not just the implementation and understanding how these costs, how your organization would actually implement and how this would interact with your own existing benefits, but the reality is that a one-size-fits-all program has differing impacts across different types of businesses. And so we can look at, say, a restaurant with 30 employees, a relatively low margin of 3%, and that has to replace 100% of their workers that take this leave. You can't, just go without your wait staff. It would reduce your margin by 10% and cost about $160 per employee, making it more challenging for that type of company to take on this type of cost. Then compare that to a larger professional service company, say a biotech research company that has 200 employees. They want to actually offer a much higher wage replacement rate for their employees that are making above where that wage replacement scale starts to taper off, and they have a healthier margin. It still would eat into their margin by over nearly 2.5%, and it would cost an additional $540 per employee in terms of net costs if they only need to replace 50% of their workers. So they have a little more flexibility in allowing leave and not needing to replace their workers. So when you look across different types of companies, I think it's important to understand how, again, this one-size-fits-all program will have significantly different impacts. Next slide. So I tried to run through that very quickly, and hopefully we were able to transition and get our thoughts around each of these propositions on top of the Gallagher debate. And I know that going into the ballot, there are several other major items, but we look forward to any questions or feedback that anyone on the call might have, or if you might have in the coming months heading into November. But thank you again, and happy to answer questions if there are any.
Chris, you're going to get off the hook easy today. No questions from the audience. I guess you did a pretty good job explaining these different propositions. As I mentioned, we have released a ballot guide on these different propositions that we have looked at in Amendment B. Feel free to visit our website, www.commonsenseinstituteco.org, for more information and to get the facts and figures and data around all of these issues that will impact your life. Thanks so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at the next Common Sense Institute event.